She doesn't take any medications. Not a single one. No blood pressure pills. No cholesterol medication. No painkillers. No supplements prescribed by a doctor. Nothing. She is 93 years old. She lives alone. She wakes up before 6 in the morning, prepares her own breakfast, walks to the market twice a week, and has not been hospitalized in over 2 decades. When a team of researchers in Japan first reviewed her file, they thought there was a mistake. Files like hers don't exist. Not at 93. Not in the modern world, where the average person over 65 is managing at least 2 chronic conditions and taking at least 5 medications daily. But there was no mistake. Her name is Fumiko, and what they found when they studied her case wasn't luck. It wasn't genetics alone. It wasn't a mystery. It was a pattern. A very specific, very observable, very repeatable pattern of daily behavior that she had maintained for decades without ever calling it a health routine. My name is Dr. Kenji. I have spent over 40 years practicing medicine in Japan, specializing in aging and preventive health. And I want to tell you exactly what that pattern looks like, because most people over 50 are doing the opposite of almost everything she does, and they don't know it. What I'm going to share with you today is not motivational. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm here to show you the clinical reality of what it looks like when a human body is maintained correctly over a long period of time, and what it looks like when it isn't. Stay with me, because what Fumiko does before 9 in the morning alone is enough to change the way you think about every meal you've eaten this week. Before we continue, if you find what I'm sharing here useful, consider subscribing to this channel. I release new content regularly on aging, disease prevention, and the science of how the body responds to the choices we make every single day. If you want to be notified when new videos come out, turn on the bell. Now let's get into it. The first thing most people get wrong about aging is breakfast. Not because they skip it, not because they eat too much, but because they eat the wrong things at the wrong time in the wrong combination, and the body spends the rest of the day trying to recover from it. Fumiko's first meal of the day looks almost nothing like what most adults in the United States eat in the morning. There is no cereal, no juice, no toast with jam, no flavored yogurt, no protein bar. None of the things that are marketed as healthy morning foods but are, in clinical terms, metabolic provocations. What she eats is this: a small bowl of miso soup, a piece of grilled fish, usually mackerel or salmon never processed, a small portion of cooked rice, and occasionally a half block of firm tofu. That is the entire meal. It takes her about 20 minutes to eat, and she eats it sitting down without a screen in front of her. Let me explain why each of these elements matters, because the combination is not accidental. It is the result of a food culture that was shaped over centuries by populations that had to survive on what the land and sea provided, and in doing so, accidentally optimized human nutrition in ways that Western dietary science is only now beginning to document. The fish is the most critical element. Mackerel and salmon are both extremely high in omega-3 fatty acids, specifically EPA and docosahexaenoic acid, which is DHA. These 2 compounds are not optional for human health. They are structural components of cell membranes throughout the body, and in the brain in particular. Without adequate EPA and DHA, cell membranes become less fluid, less responsive, and less capable of transmitting signals efficiently. In practical terms, inflammation increases, cognition declines, and cardiovascular risk rises. But here is what most people over 50 do not know. The body's ability to convert plant-based omega-3s, the kind found in flaxseed and walnuts, into usable EPA and DHA declines dramatically with age. A person in their 30s might convert enough. A person in their 60s almost certainly does not. This means that for adults over 50, marine source omega-3s, from actual fish, not supplements, become functionally essential in a way they simply were not earlier in life. Fumiko has been eating fish every morning for as long as she can remember. Not because she knew the science, because it was the food available. And it is one of the primary reasons that her inflammatory markers, when researchers finally measured them, were closer to those of a healthy 45-year-old than a woman approaching 100. Now let's talk about the protein more broadly. The miso soup and tofu both contain soy protein, which in Japan has been consumed in fermented and non-fermented forms for centuries. Soy protein is a complete protein, meaning it contains all 9 essential amino acids the body cannot produce on its own. For aging adults, this matters enormously because after 50, the body begins to lose muscle mass at a rate of 1 to 2% per year in a process called sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is not just about strength. It is about survival. Muscle tissue is the body's largest reservoir of amino acids. It plays a direct role in glucose metabolism. When muscle mass declines, insulin sensitivity declines with it, meaning blood sugar becomes harder to regulate, which is one of the primary pathways into type 2 diabetes in older adults. Preventing sarcopenia requires 2 things: adequate protein intake and sufficient physical stimulus. Fumiko's breakfast addresses the first. Her morning movement, which I'll explain in the next section, addresses the second. The other element worth examining is what is not in her breakfast. There is almost no sugar. The rice contains carbohydrates, but they are complex carbohydrates with a much lower glycemic index than bread or cereal, and they are consumed alongside fat and protein, which slows glucose absorption further. There is no juice, and this point is more significant than it sounds. A glass of orange juice, which most people consider healthy, contains approximately 25 grams of sugar in a form that reaches the bloodstream almost immediately, without the fiber that slows absorption when you eat the whole fruit. The blood glucose spike that follows a high-sugar breakfast triggers a corresponding spike in insulin. Insulin drives glucose into cells. Blood sugar drops. The body reads this drop as a stress signal. Cortisol rises. Appetite increases. Energy drops. And the metabolic cycle of the morning is already compromised before 9 a.m. Fumiko's breakfast does none of this. Her blood sugar rises modestly after eating and returns to baseline smoothly, without the spike and crash pattern that characterizes most Western morning meals. This metabolic stability in the first hours of the day has downstream effects on energy, inflammation, hormone regulation, and even sleep quality that night. This is not a diet. It is a biological operating condition, and it begins before sunrise. What she does next is so ordinary that most researchers almost didn't document it. It didn't look like medicine. It didn't look like therapy. It barely looked like exercise. Every morning after breakfast, Fumiko walks. Not a power walk. Not a structured cardio session with a heart rate target. A walk. Down the street, around the market area, sometimes through a small park near her home. The distance varies. Some mornings it is 15 minutes. Some mornings it is 40. She does not track it. She does not think about it as exercise. She simply moves her body through space, outside, after eating. This practice has a name in Japan. It is called overlook, and while the word simply means walking, the cultural relationship the Japanese have with daily ambulatory movement is fundamentally different from how most Westerners think about physical activity. In Japan, especially among the elderly, walking is not a workout. It is a condition of daily life. It is how you get places, how you think, how you process the morning. It is not scheduled. It is not optional. It simply happens. And the physiological effects of this kind of habitual, low-intensity daily movement are profound and distinct from the effects of higher-intensity structured exercise. Let me explain the difference because this is a point that most fitness-oriented health content gets completely wrong. High-intensity exercise, the kind most people associate with fitness, has enormous benefits. It improves cardiovascular capacity, burns fuel efficiently, and stimulates hormonal responses that are beneficial over the long term. But for adults over 50, high-intensity exercise also carries a cost. Recovery is longer. Inflammatory markers spike temporarily after intense exertion. Joint stress accumulates. And critically, the motivational and logistical demands of a structured high-intensity routine mean that most older adults do it inconsistently or not at all. Low-intensity daily walking does something different. It operates through a completely different set of physiological pathways. First, walking after eating, which is exactly what Fumiko does, has a measurable and immediate effect on postprandial blood glucose. A 15-minute walk taken within 30 minutes of finishing a meal reduces the blood glucose response to that meal by up to 22% compared to sitting still. This effect is well documented in peer-reviewed research and has been replicated across multiple populations. The mechanism is straightforward. Muscle contractions during walking activate glucose transporters in muscle cells that pull glucose out of the bloodstream directly, without requiring insulin. This is not a small effect. For an older adult managing blood sugar, this daily habit has the same directional impact as a class of medications. Second, daily walking at low intensity maintains synovial fluid circulation in the joints. Synovial fluid is what lubricates cartilage surfaces in joints like the knees, hips, and ankles. This fluid is not pumped by the cardiovascular system. It moves through compression and decompression, meaning joints need to move regularly to distribute lubrication effectively. When older adults become sedentary, synovial fluid stagnates. Cartilage dries out at the surface level. Friction increases. Pain follows. And pain leads to more sedentary behavior, which leads to faster joint degeneration. Fumiko has walked every morning for decades. Her joints, when examined by the research team, showed minimal degenerative changes relative to her age. She had no knee pain, no hip pain, no significant arthritis. Her gait was steady, her balance functional. Third, and this is the one that most people overlook, daily morning walking outdoors regulates the circadian rhythm in a way that indoor sedentary behavior cannot. Morning light exposure, particularly in the first hour after waking, suppresses residual melatonin, stabilizes cortisol's natural morning peak, and anchors the body's internal clock. This has downstream effects on sleep quality, hormonal timing, immune function, and metabolic efficiency. Fumiko is not doing this intentionally. She is simply walking outside. But her body is receiving a daily biological calibration that the majority of adults who stay indoors in the morning are missing entirely. This is not a fitness habit. It is a maintenance habit. The distinction matters because maintenance habits are sustainable across a lifetime in ways that performance habits rarely are. Now, I need to tell you something that seems contradictory on the surface. Something that, if you follow mainstream health advice in the United States, is probably going to conflict with what you've been told. Fumiko eats a significant amount of sodium, more than what American dietary guidelines recommend for someone her age. And yet her blood pressure at 93 is not catastrophically high. Her cardiovascular system is not in failure. She does not have the sodium-related complications that Western medicine has been warning about for decades. How is this possible? The answer is not that sodium doesn't matter. It does. The answer is that where sodium comes from and what it comes with changes how the body processes it. And this is a distinction that public health messaging has done a very poor job of communicating. In the United States and much of the Western world, the primary sources of dietary sodium are ultra-processed foods, packaged snacks, deli meats, canned soups, fast food, frozen meals, bread, condiments. These foods deliver sodium in isolation or near isolation, stripped of the accompanying minerals and compounds that would naturally accompany salt in a traditional food environment. In Fumiko's diet, sodium enters the body primarily through miso, soy sauce, and naturally salted fish. These are not the same as table salt added to processed food. Let me explain why. Miso is a fermented paste made from soybeans, salt, and a mold culture called koji. The fermentation process transforms the soybeans over weeks or months, producing a complex matrix of amino acids, organic acids, B vitamins, and bioactive compounds that do not exist in the raw ingredients. Among these compounds are natriuretic peptides, molecular signals that help the kidneys regulate sodium excretion, and isoflavones that have documented vasodilatory effects, meaning they support the flexibility and function of blood vessel walls. In other words, the sodium in miso arrives packaged with compounds that partially mitigate its blood pressure elevating effects. This is not speculation. There are longitudinal studies from Japan showing that miso consumption is associated with lower incidence of cardiovascular events even in populations with high overall sodium intake, a finding that puzzled researchers until they began analyzing the full biochemical profile of traditional Japanese sodium sources. Soy sauce, similarly, is a fermented condiment with a different biochemical profile than table salt. Traditional soy sauce, not the mass-produced industrial versions, but the kind made through actual fermentation, contains antioxidants, organic acids, and peptides that are produced during the fermentation process and are not present in plain sodium chloride. There is another critical factor. Fumiko's diet is extremely high in potassium. She eats seaweed regularly, particularly kombu and wakame, along with sweet potatoes, daikon radish, and various vegetables that are inherently high in potassium. Potassium is sodium's physiological counterpart. The kidneys regulate the balance between these two minerals constantly. When potassium intake is high, the kidneys excrete more sodium. Blood pressure is sensitive not to sodium alone, but to the sodium to potassium ratio. A diet high in both sodium and potassium is fundamentally different from a diet high in sodium alone. Most adults eating processed Western diets consume roughly 4 times more sodium than potassium. Traditional Japanese diets, despite high sodium content, often approach a 1-to-1 ratio due to the volume of potassium-rich plant foods consumed. This ratio difference explains much of what looks like a paradox. What Fumiko's relationship with sodium teaches us is a broader lesson. Context is everything in nutrition. The same mineral delivered through different food vehicles with different accompanying compounds, alongside different nutritional patterns, produces different outcomes in the body. This is why studying single nutrients in isolation so often fails to produce actionable conclusions. The body doesn't process individual compounds. It processes meals. It processes patterns. It processes entire dietary environments. And Fumiko's dietary environment, built over 93 years, has been constructed in a way that the body handles with remarkable efficiency. Every single day, without exception, Fumiko eats natto. If you are not familiar with natto, it is fermented soybeans, and I want to be direct with you, it is an acquired taste. The texture is sticky, almost viscous. The smell is powerful. Many people outside Japan find it difficult to eat on the first attempt or the second or the fifth. But Fumiko has been eating it every morning of her adult life, and from a clinical standpoint, this habit alone may be one of the most significant things she does for her long-term health. Let me explain what natto actually does in the body, because the mechanisms are specific and well documented. Natto is made by fermenting cooked soybeans with a bacterium called Bacillus subtilis var. Natto. This fermentation process produces several biologically active compounds that are not present in unfermented soybeans. The most studied of these is nattokinase, an enzyme that has a documented fibrinolytic effect, meaning it breaks down fibrin, the protein network that forms the structure of blood clots. Elevated fibrin in the bloodstream is associated with increased clotting risk, which is a significant cardiovascular risk factor, particularly in older adults whose circulatory systems are already under increased pressure from decades of use. Nattokinase has been studied in clinical trials in Japan, Korea, and more recently in the United States, and the results consistently show a meaningful reduction in clotting markers in adults who consume natto or nattokinase supplements regularly. The effect is not as potent as pharmaceutical anticoagulants, but it is real, measurable, and comes without the bleeding risk that accompanies medications like warfarin. But nattokinase is not the only reason natto matters. Natto is one of the richest dietary sources of vitamin K2, specifically the -7 Malawian kwacha form, in the human food supply. A single 100-gram serving of natto contains more -7 Malawian kwachas than almost any other food on the planet. And vitamin K2 -7 Malawian kwachas has a biological role that most people in the West are completely unaware of, because vitamin K2 is not the same as vitamin K1, and they do not do the same things in the body. Vitamin K1, found in leafy greens, is primarily involved in blood clotting. It's the vitamin that helps wounds close. Most doctors and most patients know about K1, but K2 operates through a completely different pathway. It activates proteins that direct calcium in the body. Specifically, K2 activates a protein called matrix GLA protein, which prevents calcium from depositing in arterial walls. It also activates osteocalcin, a protein that directs calcium into bone tissue. In populations with low vitamin K2 intake, which describes the majority of adults eating Western diets, calcium circulates in the blood without adequate guidance. Some of it is deposited into arteries, contributing to arterial stiffness and calcification. Some of it fails to reach bone tissue, contributing to osteoporosis. These are not random diseases. They are, in part, the consequence of a specific nutritional deficiency that has become invisible in modern diets because the food sources of K2, fermented foods, organ meats, certain aged cheeses, have largely disappeared from Western eating patterns. Fumiko, eating natto every morning, is receiving a dose of -7 Malawian kwacha's vitamin K2 that keeps her arterial calcium regulation functioning at a level most Western adults have never experienced. Her arteries, when researchers measured their elasticity, showed significantly less stiffening than would be expected at her age. Now, beyond the specific compounds in natto, there is the broader matter of what fermented food does to the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome, the ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms living in the digestive tract, is increasingly recognized as a central regulatory system in the body. It does not just digest food, produces neurotransmitters. It regulates immune responses. It influences inflammatory markers throughout the body, and it changes dramatically with age. After 60, the diversity of the gut microbiome typically declines. Protective bacterial species become less abundant. Opportunistic species fill the gap. Intestinal permeability, the tightness of the barrier between the gut lumen and the bloodstream, increases. A condition sometimes called leaky gut in popular media, but more accurately described as increased intestinal permeability in clinical literature. When this barrier becomes more permeable, bacterial fragments and other molecules from the gut interior enter the bloodstream, triggering systemic inflammatory responses that over time contribute to cardiovascular disease, neurological decline, metabolic dysfunction, and immune dysregulation. Fermented foods, consumed consistently, supply the gut with live bacterial cultures that compete against pathogenic species and support the integrity of the intestinal barrier. Not all fermented foods do this equally. The bacterial strains matter, the fermentation method matters, and the frequency of consumption matters. But natto, consumed daily over decades, represents one of the most consistent and potent gut-supporting dietary habits in any traditional food culture that researchers have studied. Fumiko does not think of natto as a probiotic. She eats it because she has always eaten it. But her gut microbiome, when analyzed, showed a diversity and a bacterial profile more consistent with someone 30 years younger. Chronic low-grade inflammation is the underlying mechanism behind most of the diseases that kill people over 50 in the developed world. Not acute inflammation, the kind that causes redness and swelling after an injury, which is a protective and necessary response. Chronic, systemic, low-grade inflammation, the kind you cannot feel, the kind that produces no obvious symptoms for years or decades, the kind that silently damages blood vessels, degrades insulin receptors, accelerates neuronal loss, and promotes the growth of cancerous cells. Most adults over 50 are living with elevated chronic inflammation. They don't know it because it doesn't hurt. The only way to detect it is through blood markers, specifically C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. When researchers drew Fumiko's blood and looked at these markers, they found levels that were not just normal for her age. They were low by any standard. What is she doing that keeps her inflammatory system suppressed without medication? The answer is not a single thing. It is an architecture of daily habits, each of which has a documented anti-inflammatory effect, and which together create a cumulative suppression of the body's inflammatory activity that pharmaceuticals would struggle to replicate without significant side effects. The first and most significant element is the fish. I mentioned omega-3 fatty acids in the section on breakfast, but I want to be more specific here about the anti-inflammatory mechanism. EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, is converted in the body into signaling molecules called resolvins and protectins. These are not just anti-inflammatory in the sense of blocking inflammatory signals. They are pro-resolving. They actively instruct the immune system to terminate inflammatory responses and clear inflammatory debris. The body cannot produce resolvins without EPA, and EPA comes almost exclusively from marine sources in the quantities needed to generate a meaningful clinical effect. Studies comparing populations that consume fish daily versus those that rarely eat fish show statistically significant differences in inflammatory markers across virtually every population studied. Across Japan, Greenland, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific Islands. This is not a controversial finding. It is one of the most consistently replicated observations in nutritional epidemiology. Fumiko eats fish every single day. She has eaten fish every single day for 93 years. The cumulative anti-inflammatory effect of this habit is almost impossible to overstate. The second element is green tea. Fumiko drinks green tea multiple times throughout the day. In the morning, after lunch, in the afternoon. Not black tea. Not coffee. Green tea, specifically the kind made from whole dried leaves rather than industrial powder. Green tea contains a polyphenol called epigallocatechin gallate, commonly referred to as EGCG, which is one of the most studied anti-inflammatory compounds in nutritional science. EGCG inhibits several pro-inflammatory signaling pathways, specifically NF-κB, which is a master regulator of immune and inflammatory responses in the body. When NF-κB activity is chronically elevated, inflammation is chronically elevated. When it is modulated downward, the body operates in a lower baseline inflammatory state. EGCG also inhibits enzymes involved in cartilage breakdown, which is relevant to joint health and osteoarthritis. And it has documented effects on the mTOR pathway, a cellular aging pathway that, when chronically activated, accelerates biological aging at the cellular level. The third element is what she does not cook with. Fumiko's kitchen contains no refined vegetable oils, no canola oil, no soybean oil, no corn oil. She cooks with small amounts of sesame oil, which is high in sesamin and anti-inflammatory lignin, and she often doesn't cook with added fat at all, preparing many of her foods by steaming, simmering in dashi broth, or eating them in their natural form. Refined vegetable oils high in omega-6 fatty acids, which are the dominant cooking oils in both American homes and the American food industry, are precursors to pro-inflammatory signaling molecules. The body converts linoleic acid, the primary omega-6 in vegetable oils, into arachidonic acid, which is then converted into prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and other molecules that drive inflammation. This is not inherently pathological. Some inflammatory response is necessary. But when omega-6 intake is dramatically disproportionate to omega-3 intake, the inflammatory balance tilts. The ideal omega-6 to omega-3 ratio for human health is estimated at somewhere between 2:1 and 4:1. The average American adult consumes a ratio of approximately 20:1. Fumiko's ratio, based on her dietary pattern, is estimated to be close to 3:1. This single difference in lipid balance, invisible to any standard dietary advice framework, may account for more of the inflammatory difference between her and a comparable American elder than any other single variable. There is a practice that occurs in the middle of Fumiko's day that most people in the United States would not even recognize as a health behavior. After lunch, she rests. Not a full sleep, not an extended nap. A deliberate, horizontal rest of somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes, in a quiet room with minimal light. This is called inamuri in Japanese, though technically inamuri refers to falling asleep while doing something else. The tradition here is more intentional than that. It is a rest practice built into the rhythm of her day as naturally as eating or walking. She does not feel guilty about it. She does not resist it. She simply stops, lies down, and allows her body and nervous system to recalibrate. The science behind this practice is far more substantial than most people realize, and it has been actively suppressed in Western productivity culture in a way that has measurable health consequences. Let me start with cortisol. Cortisol is the body's primary stress hormone, and it follows a predictable daily rhythm in healthy individuals. It peaks in the first 30 to 45 minutes after waking, a phenomenon called the cortisol awakening response, and then gradually declines throughout the day. By early afternoon, cortisol should be at roughly half its morning peak. This mid-afternoon dip corresponds with a natural decline in alertness and reaction time that most adults experience and either fight with caffeine or simply endure. This dip is not a malfunction. It is the body's signal for consolidation. Brief rest during this window allows the nervous system to process the morning's sensory input, consolidate short-term memories into longer-term storage, and reduce the accumulated physiological cost of the morning's activity and stress. Adults who take a short rest during this window, 15 to 30 minutes, show improved cognitive performance in the afternoon, lower afternoon cortisol levels, and better cardiovascular markers compared to adults who remain continuously active. A study published by researchers at the Harvard Medical School found that a 30-minute midday nap taken 3 or more times per week was associated with a 37% reduction in coronary mortality. This is not a marginal effect. A 37% reduction in coronary mortality from resting in the middle of the day is a finding that, if it were a drug, would have been on the front page of every medical journal in the world. But because rest is culturally devalued in productivity-oriented societies, this research has had almost no impact on public health recommendations. Fumiko does not know about this study. She rests because her body asks her to, and because her culture does not penalize her for listening to it. Now let's talk about what happens to the body of someone who does not rest. For most adults in the United States, the afternoon dip is fought. With coffee, with screens, with stimulation, with sheer force of will. Cortisol is pushed artificially higher. The sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight system, remains activated. Inflammatory signaling increases. Blood pressure remains elevated. Heart rate variability declines. By evening, the body has been in a state of low-grade physiological stress for 14 or 15 consecutive hours. This is not normal. It is normalized. Those are different things. Fumiko's sleep at night is also structurally different from what most Western adults experience. She goes to sleep early, typically between 9 and 10 in the evening, and wakes naturally without an alarm before 6 in the morning. Her sleep duration is consistent, typically 7 to 8 hours, and the consistency of her sleep-wake timing, what chronobiologists call sleep regularity, may matter as much as the total hours. Sleep regularity, going to sleep and waking at the same time each day, is a more powerful predictor of mortality risk than sleep duration in several longitudinal studies. The reason is biological. The circadian clock governs not just sleep, but the timing of hormone release, immune function, DNA repair, cellular autophagy, the body's internal housekeeping process, and dozens of other physiological rhythms. When sleep timing is irregular, these rhythms fall out of synchronization. The body performs maintenance at the wrong times. Systems that should be repairing are active. Systems that should be active are suppressed. Over years and decades, the cumulative cost of this desynchronization becomes visible in accelerated biological aging. Fumiko's sleep has not been irregular in decades. She does not stay up late on weekends. She does not travel across time zones. She does not shift her schedule. Her biological clock is calibrated with a precision that most modern adults have lost so gradually they don't remember what calibrated felt like. Now I want to tell you about something invisible. Something that is not on Fumiko's grocery list. Something that is not in her kitchen. Something that is not in her daily schedule. Something that most people in the developed world consume in quantities they have no awareness of, because it is so thoroughly embedded in the modern food environment that it has become indistinguishable from food itself. Fumiko does not eat ultra-processed food. Not as a rule she consciously follows. Not as a discipline she maintains through willpower. Simply because it has never been part of her food environment. The foods she grew up with, the foods she learned to cook, the foods she associates with comfort and nourishment and celebration, are whole foods prepared through traditional methods. There is no processed food in her reference frame. There is no absence to resist because there was never a presence to begin with. This is an important distinction because the narrative around processed food in health media tends to frame it as a temptation to be overcome through individual virtue. That framing misses the real issue. The real issue is that ultra-processed foods are biologically disruptive in ways that go far beyond their macronutrient content, and that the populations with the lowest exposure to them show the most dramatic health outcomes, regardless of the specific healthy habits they practice. What exactly is ultra-processed food, clinically speaking? The NOVA classification system, developed by Brazilian nutritional researchers and now used in major epidemiological studies worldwide, defines ultra-processed foods as formulations made entirely or mostly from substances extracted from foods or derived from food constituents, with little or no whole food, and containing additives such as emulsifiers, stabilizers, flavor enhancers, artificial colors, and preservatives. This includes packaged bread made with more than 5 ingredients, flavored yogurt, breakfast cereal, chips, crackers, frozen meals, most deli meat, sodas, energy drinks, most protein bars, and the vast majority of anything sold in a package with an ingredient list longer than 5 items. These foods share several characteristics that make them biologically disruptive regardless of their caloric content. First, they are engineered to override satiety signals. The combination of processed fat, refined carbohydrate, salt, and flavor amplifiers at precise ratios produces a palatability that bypasses the normal mechanisms by which the brain registers fullness. The result is consistent overconsumption not through weakness, but through a designed circumvention of regulatory biology. Second, ultra-processed foods are almost uniformly low in dietary fiber. Fiber is not just a digestive aid. It is the primary fuel source for the beneficial bacteria in the gut microbiome. Without adequate fiber, beneficial bacterial populations shrink. Short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, which seal the intestinal lining and reduce inflammatory signaling, decline in production, and the gut environment degrades in ways that promote systemic inflammation. Third, many additives in ultra-processed foods have documented effects on gut permeability, hormonal signaling, and the liver's detoxification capacity. Emulsifiers, for example, compounds like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose that are used to improve the texture and shelf life of processed foods, have been shown in animal studies and early human research to disrupt the mucus layer of the intestinal wall, bringing gut bacteria into closer contact with intestinal cells and triggering inflammatory responses. Fumiko's gut has never been exposed to these compounds at any meaningful frequency. Her intestinal environment has been maintained on a diet of fermented foods, whole fish, cooked vegetables, and minimally processed grains her entire life. The integrity of her intestinal barrier, her gut microbiome diversity, and her systemic inflammatory markers are all consistent with someone who has never subjected their digestive system to the accumulated insult of a lifetime of ultra-processed food consumption. This is not about restriction. Fumiko is not depriving herself of anything she wants. She is simply eating in the food environment she has always lived in. The tragedy for most adults in the United States is that the food environment they have always lived in was constructed around them by an industry with no biological interest in their health. And the damage accumulates so slowly, so invisibly, that it feels like aging when it is largely something else entirely. There is another absence in Fumiko's life that is equally significant but less obviously food-related. She does not live in a state of chronic social isolation. She is embedded in a network of neighbors, local shopkeepers, and community members she sees regularly, naturally, without scheduling social time as a separate activity. The literature on loneliness and mortality is now unambiguous. Chronic social isolation increases all-cause mortality by a magnitude comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes per day. The biological mechanisms are real. Loneliness activates the same stress pathways as physical threat, chronically elevating cortisol, inflammatory cytokines, and sympathetic nervous system activity. Fumiko's social fabric is not a feature of her personality. It is a feature of her environment, and it keeps her alive in ways that no supplement can replicate. After more than 40 years of studying aging patients in Japan, after following cohorts of elderly individuals in rural Okinawa, in coastal fishing villages, in traditional mountain communities, I have identified a pattern that appears so consistently across the longest-lived individuals I have encountered that I no longer consider it coincidental. It is not a single habit. It is not a single food. It is not a single biomarker. It is a structural coherence, a way in which each element of the daily routine reinforces the others, creating a system that is more protective than any of its individual parts would suggest. Let me describe what this pattern looks like across dozens of individuals whose cases I have reviewed, because Fumiko is not an anomaly. She is a representative of something reproducible. Every one of these individuals eats food they recognize, not food described to them as healthy, not food assembled from nutritional information, food they learned from their parents and grandparents, food tied to a cultural memory of what nourishment means. The foods differ. Okinawan elders eat differently from elders in Hokkaido, who eat differently from elders in rural Nagano. But the relationship to food is the same. It is intimate, habitual, and old. There is no cognitive negotiation around eating. The patterns are laid down so deeply they do not require decision-making. Every one of these individuals moves daily, but not maximally. None of them have ever belonged to a gym. None of them have followed a structured fitness program. They walk. They work in small gardens. They carry their own groceries. They climb stairs. The movement is functional, embedded in ordinary life, not separated from it into a scheduled event. And because it is not scheduled, it was never abandoned. It has simply been happening every day for 80 or 90 years. Every one of these individuals sleeps on a consistent schedule and treats rest as non-negotiable. They go to sleep when darkness comes and wake when light returns, a pattern that sounds primitive but is in fact precisely calibrated to human circadian biology. They do not fight the evening. They do not manufacture alertness at midnight. Their bodies cycle through sleep architecture, the progression from light sleep through deep slow-wave sleep into REM, with the regularity that cellular repair and immune consolidation require. Every one of these individuals eats fermented food of some kind, daily. For most, it is miso, natto, or pickled vegetables. For some, it is fermented fish. The specific food varies. The daily frequency does not. This is not a coincidence. Fermented food cultures that have persisted for centuries did so because the populations that relied on them were healthier. The selection pressure was biological before it was cultural. Every one of these individuals has a low burden of what I would call metabolic noise, the chronic overstimulation of the endocrine and immune systems by processed food additives, refined sugars, omega-6 dominant fats, irregular sleep, and social isolation. Their bodies are not quieter because they are exceptional. They are quieter because they have been less assaulted. What Fumiko's case reveals, what all of these cases reveal taken together, is that the human body has remarkable default programming for a long, disease-free life. It will execute that programming faithfully if the inputs it receives are consistent with what it was built to process. The problem is not that health is complicated. The problem is that the modern environment has made health complicated by systematically replacing the simple inputs the body expects with a completely different set of inputs that the body cannot efficiently process. Fumiko has not hacked longevity. She has not discovered a secret. She has simply, and almost entirely by accident of circumstance, continued to provide her body with the inputs it was designed for. And her body has responded the way bodies respond to appropriate inputs, by continuing to function. This is the pattern. It is not mysterious. It is not out of reach. But understanding what it requires in a world where almost everything in the food environment, the built environment, and the social environment pushes in the opposite direction, requires a clarity about the mechanisms that most health communication has never provided. That is what we have been building together in this video. And what comes next is where we put it to use.